Hello everyone, this is another Storytime with Critical Rocket, and this is a short story from a issue of Battle Technology magazine, issue 21, and it's called A Leg to Stand On. Report for the Journal of the Federated Commonwealth Medical Association. Assistant Force Leader Philip Tillinen regained consciousness in time to see his dropship lifting off without him. Fighting the darkness that surely means death to any mech warrior, Tillinen managed to raise his head just enough to see, not 500 meters off, the House Hiritsu Overlord-class dropship, Fist of the People, rising on a column of fire into the black midnight sky. There were lights moving quickly about on the ground recently vacated by the dropship, lights which Philip Tillinen was sure were enemy mechs, and vehicles raging impotently against the fleeing victors. Tillinen's housemaster and political reliability officer would have been proud of his first utterance. The raid has been a great success, particularly if mine is the only mech lost. For the glory of House Lau. Tillinen's next thoughts were rather treasonous when compared to the first. He tried to wave a defiant fist to accompany the bravado of his first statement, and indescribable pain shot through his entire body at the first hint of movement. He screamed curses in 3 languages, trying to will himself beyond the pain and past the pain, and knowing that he would not succeed. His field of vision was obscured by a red fog, and his other senses were overwhelmed by the fire that ravaged him. As consciousness faded again, he was almost certain that he reached out to his right of his ruined cockpit of his hunchback to activate his emergency locator beacon, but he couldn't be sure. He dreamed a convoluted dream of blood and fire and flying. He heard over and over the words of Housemaster York, describing the goals and objectives and acceptable losses associated with this little strategic metals raid into the Federated Commonwealth. He heard how this planet, Rabala, had been a happy and productive member of the Capellan Confederation until the motherless savages of the AFFS descended with overwhelming numbers and killed 9/10 of the population before enslaving the few that remained. He heard again the reminder that this raid was not truly an act of theft, since House Lau still legally and morally claimed all the worlds lost in the 4th Succession War. Then Tillinen was flying. He was flying down out of the dropship, his ablative shield glowing with entry friction and his strap-on landing jets firing without a flaw. He still flew, floating over the arid landscape as his hunchback made its best speed towards the refined metals storage area near the spaceport. The dream suddenly assumed a more blood-red tinge, as militia infantry threw explosive packs and inferno missiles against the advancing Lau mechs. Philip Tillinen saw the faces of the citizens of Rabala, the little mining colony that grudgingly gave its titanium and iron to the hated Davians now, and he saw how they threw themselves in his path and tried to sneak SRM shots at his cockpit, and were instead mashed to a bloody pulp by his hunchback's feet. He saw the control tower at the small spaceport, and he realised that the old Capellan maps of the complex were all wrong, and that many improvements had been made since the war. Tillinen briefly wondered, as 2 shots from his huge Kaliyama big-bore autocannon blew the upper levels of the tower, where the resistance fighters opposed to House Davian were hiding. The dream shifted to the prize, the object of the raid. Tons and tons of refined titanium, waiting to be shaped into armour plating and gun barrels, stacked like cordwood, loaded onto carriers for the run back to the dropship. There were dead men and women scattered about the storage area, some killed where they stood firing hand arms at the invaders, and several dead within the wreckage of the forklifts with which they tried to ram the Lau mechs. Tillinen was beginning to wonder about the savagery and desperation that had characterised the defence of Rabala. He'd started to question the unquestionable loyalty of these hapless citizens to the Capellan Confederation when the battalion commanders sounded the alert. Enemy mech forces incoming from the north, estimated strength of 1 reinforced company, loyal soldiers of the Confederation, rally at the dropship. With the omniscience of Dream, Tillinen believed that he could see the insignia, a red rose and bloody thorns on enemy mechs as they raced in pursuit of the fleeing Lau raiders, but he couldn't be sure. Philip Tillinen awoke with a start in the hot morning sun, and the pain just about slapped him unconscious again. This time, though, he proved to be its master. The feedback yowling through his Euro helmet still messed with his eyesight, but the pain and the nausea lessened somewhat as he asserted control over himself, and he tried to assess his situation. As near as he could tell, his hunchback and he were 2 hurting units. Ammo explosion. Must have been an ammo explosion. Left arm and torso of mech failed to respond to commands. Or diagnostics. He spoke for the benefit of his cockpit data recorder, just as he'd been trained to do. Perhaps a new generation of soldiers of House Lau would listen to his words someday and learn from his mistakes. I will try to stand the unit now. Tillinen heard a shrieking sound and felt shudders run up his unit's left side. A ghost pain filtered through the neurohelmet feedback, but, in a moment, he stood once again upright with a view of the world. Standing manoeuvre successful, he exulted through gritted teeth. Sensors still marginal at best. There seems to be damage to the left hip actuator, but this hunchback can travel. Armament reduced to 1 right arm medium laser. 3 heat sinks lost, but I still have more than enough. I must evade enemy, search parties, and avoid capture, until a pickup can be arranged. Slowly creaking at every joint, Tillinen felt his mech lumber off down the long hill into the desert. Rabala is not the kind of planet that travel agents describe as tourist-friendly. In fact, there wouldn't have been much more than that. Fat, scuttling scorpions and salt-laden dead oceans there if a survey hadn't located titanium deposits near the South Pole. Assistant Force Leader Philip Tillinen was discovering these facts for himself as he's made his way into the wilderness. He found that he didn't have a whole lot to say for his cockpit data recorder once the novelty of his survival had worn off. The recorder's built-in chronometer would have shown hour after hour of silence and laboured breathing, punctuated by the odd curse as that faulty hip actuator caused the occasional stumble. It was 10 hours after regaining control, as planetary twilight was setting in, that Tillinen once again shared the benefits of his experience with posterity. Drek! This was nothing new, really. He'd uttered that particular expletive some 17 times since he'd been left behind, mostly due to the treacherous footing in the desert. No, the really interesting part came after that. AFL Tillinen had company. Look at the size of that scorpion. No, wait, I'll have to describe it. I know the visual recorders went out with the sensors. The damn thing's easily twice as long as my hunchback's foot. It must weigh 200 kilos. Hey, it's coming this way. Let me see if my last medium laser has any punch left in it. With twinges of pain slicing through his neurohelmet, he raised the hunchback's right arm. He manually aimed the laser there, a task made doubly difficult by the pain and the growing darkness. He silently breathed a prayer, knowing that his political reliability officer wouldn't appreciate such anti-state mutterings on an official cockpit data recorder, and triggered the weapon. The air crackled with energy and the familiar weapon fire surge of heat washed over Tillinen. The gigantic scorpion vanished in a blue bolt, replaced by a scorch mark and some unidentifiable ick on the sand and rock. Tillinen was satisfied and said so. Thanks to the target of opportunity, I know now I can effectively aim my last remaining weapon. I am not defenseless. Tillinen saw then that he was in a shallow depression, hidden from the surrounding desert plains by a low rocky rim. Without effective sensors or navigational computers, he didn't feel that nighttime travel was worth the risk. He decided that this was as good a place as any to sleep for the night. Besides, in his wounded and somewhat delirious state, he'd been remembering last night's vivid dreams. He wanted desperately to return to them, perhaps to see just what had gone wrong with the mission. He was almost certain that the dreams held the key to his failure, and his fate, but he couldn't be sure. Although his first dream had been of flying, his second night's fantasy travels were accomplished with feet of pure lead. He ran and ran towards a dropship that forever stayed at distance, even as the enemy mech force gained on his hunchback with relentless speed. Tillinen turned left, triggering his autocannon at the nearest enemy mech, a Phoenix Hawk, whose pilot saw the error of his ways and decided to confront the hunchback from a discreet distance. That wild shot bought him some time, but his leaden feet betrayed him again. He could come no closer to his dropship than half a kilometre. With a sinking heart, Assistant Force Leader Tillinen saw the last Lao mech aside from himself enter the dropship. The great doors closed, and the engines began to power up for the boost to orbit. He was to be left for dead. Suddenly, his threat receiver beeped a warning. Being abandoned on a hostile planet was not his most immediate concern. Caught flat on his supernaturally heavy feet, Tillinen and his hunchback could do nothing as a pair of 7K Wolverines, replete with pulse lasers and twin SRM launchers, jumped into his position. One landed not 50 meters in front, while the other landed the same distance behind. Tillinen triggered his autocannon and lasers at the front target, centering the crosshairs on the large red rose with bloody thorns painted dead center on the torso. As he did so, incongruously he thought of a joke. There was a kind of phony commendation that he'd heard was given out by the mercs of McCarran's armoured cavalry. It was given to any member who survived a major weapon barrage directed at his or her thin rear armour plating. The award came as a very small sticker to be attached to the rear of the recipient's mech, directly over the engine housing, the sticker reading, "If you can read this, I'm screwed." Tillinen had once considered this kind of horseplay demeaning, not at all worthy of mech warriors in the service of House Lau. Now, however, from the perspective of memory and dream, he found the idea somehow appealing. He certainly had the experience necessary to deserve the award. The Wolverines fired everything they had, slashing the hunchback's torso armour into so many aligned crystal steel toothpicks. Tillinen experienced the impacts in a kind of dream slow motion, watching the missiles blow holes through his laser-softened mech's midsection. He marvelled at how the blasts from the two attacks cancelled each other out, allowing him to keep his hunchback standing with very little effort. His dreamy happiness was rudely interrupted, however, when his 5 remaining autocannon shells, massaged by laser heat and chemical explosions, cooked off simultaneously. Philip Tillinen felt the searing pain run up through his left side as his neurohelmet echoed his mech's agony. The case system protected his engine, but the explosion gathered up all the guts from the left torso and ejected them out of the back in a thick spray of fire, rendering the left arm and side useless. The hunchback dropped to its knees, and the 2 Wolverines jumped away, apparently content with their evening's work. Consciousness in the dream became questionable, and Tillinen was aware of a sudden quiet as his hunchback slowly tipped forward. In the dream, there came the distant sound of thunder as the loud dropship, Fist of the People, lifted off into space. Tillinen heard his own voice say, "The raid has been a great success, particularly if mine is the only mech lost, for the glory of House Lau." He tried to stop himself from gesturing, but he failed. He seemed doomed to dream a repeat performance. Through the haze of pain, he could sense his hand moving towards the activation toggle for the emergency locator beacon. It was an awkward position, and there was so much noise from the dropship and so much ruined and dangling equipment in the cockpit. He thought he'd hit the switch just before he woke up, but he couldn't be sure. Assistant Force Leader Tillinen awoke, and the sound of dropship jets stayed with him. He shook his head slowly so as not to dislodge his neurohelmet, but the sound became steadily louder. It was a moment before Tillinen realised that there was, in fact, a dropship landing quite close nearby. He gingerly stood up his unit, favouring the damaged hip actuator and avoiding even the slightest stress on the shredded left side or arm. The dawn had only recently arrived, and the huge spherical dropship descended with the low sun behind it. The cockpit data recorder caught Tillinen's next words. "Okay. Alright. Here goes nothing. Either that's the Fist of the People, or I've had it. One way or the other, it ends here." Tillinen rose out of the depression and marched his unit at best speed toward the landing dropship. There's no indication on the cockpit data recorder exactly when Assistant Force Leader Philip Tillinen realised that he was approaching a dropship whose markings, a huge red rose with bloody thorns, matched those of his enemy. His course didn't waver, nor did his speed. He simply moved in as fast as his condition allowed, opening fire with his laser upon reaching close range. In fact, the cockpit data recorder only has 9 more words on its tapes, recorded when the dropship finally opened one of its doors, and a Wolverine was sent out to confront Tillinen. Good God! How did they make it so big? Philip Tillinen will be quite a long time recovering from his injuries. I've spoken to him at length here aboard the Lancaster's Rose dropship Crown of Thorns in the secure hospital area. He's been through a terrible ordeal, and the mech warriors of the Rose should have a certain admiration for his courage and stamina. His story must be believed because there is so much corroborating data, much of which comes from Philip's own memory, as well as from the testimony of 2 Wolverine pilots involved in the incident. When I examined Philip that morning, he was wearing the traditional neurohelmet and cooling vest of a mech warrior. He'd been horribly injured, with 5 broken ribs on the left side and multiple compound fractures of the left arm and hand. His Left hip had suffered major ligament damage, making walking impossibly painful. He was clutching a data recorder, a battery power unit, and a laser pistol in his good right arm. His wounds imitated those of his battlemech, a hunchback, with a coincidence terrible to consider. You see, Philip believes he walked into the desert in his mech. He did not. His hunchback lies where it first fell, some 30 kilometers away from where we found Philip, alone and raving in the desert. We believe, from all the available evidence, that Assistant Force Leader Tillinen triggered his eject mechanism when he meant to switch on the locator beacon, and in doing so, injured himself seriously. It would seem that Philip suffered some kind of body image breakdown, believing his mech to be himself, and translating his own injury and physical problems into mech damage. The severity and complexity of such a psychosis is unique in the literature, and the effectiveness of any treatment is not predictable. We can hope that there will someday be a cure for Philip, but we cannot be sure. Dr. Michelle Campbell, Chief Medical Officer, Lancaster's Rose, Nadir Jump Point Station, Sana, April 3053.